Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Blast off on another episode of Hero Paranormal Podcast, broadcasting from the base at La Madre Mountain, just south of Area 51. My name is Ryan, the original overseer of the airwaves, bringing you an epic episode tonight. Well, where do I start? Tonight's amazing guest is Simon Siddal. Not only is Simon a great guy and returning guest, he is founder at the Conscious Music School. He has one of the most impeccable ears for music and how it relates to culture. He is an impressive expert on musical magic, weaponized sound, and conscious composition. The musical master, transforming musicians into shamanic artists and enlightening those on his path along the way. Simon Siddal, welcome to the Hero Paranormal Podcast.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be back.
It's great to have you back. It is, so much has transpired since I had you the first time. And
it's been quite a while, hasn't it? Was it 16 months, something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Since we last spoke? It's been a while. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, and you're a returning guest on the podcast. This is the second time, and there's a reason for that. You know your stuff. A lot of stuff has transpired, and since we spoken last, and what's new? How have you been? And can you tell our listeners about the Conscious Music School?
Well, the Conscious Music School is a school in both meanings of the word. One, it's a virtual online learning center. It's for musicians and music lovers to come and learn about what it is that we have been unconscious about in the art of music for a very long time now, how that's harming us, and what we can do about it to become more conscious, more heart-centered and shamanically wise artists and art lovers in the world. That's one part of what the Conscious Music School is. The other part of it is using the word school like you would say the Romantic School or the Postmodernist School. The Conscious Music School is, I hope, in the future, this is how I'm stamping it as my intention to, become a movement, that it's a school of people who understand that music is a psychically powerful force and want to use it consciously and wisely for the betterment of their fellow human beings, and to expunge from their art and from their habits all of the, you might say, to be dramatic about it, black magic processes that have been put on music in the past 100 years and more.
That's, since our last show, that show hit me pretty hard, that conversation, because I have noticed that I'm a lot more careful of what I listen to, with the exception of what my toddlers want to listen to, which is usually the same thing over and over again. And what I've noticed is for example, when I'm in any kind of state, if I get up at night and I go down to have something to eat, or if I'm in any kind of state between sleep and wake, even if I notice that in the back of my mind, I can hear the soundtracks of what they watch all day. And it's just horrifying. So it's very real. And now for those who believe that music and magic are not connected, I very much argue the opposite. And lately, well, the media, for example, and let's go into this in a minute. Music used to have a very different effect on the population. Can we go into some of what brought about, forgive the term, but dumbing down of music, much like that childhood music stuff that comes into my head whenever I have any waking moment, and the possible hidden motives for that, like who may be pulling the strings to, so to speak. Music used to be different, didn't it?
Okay, yep. That question opens up an enormous subject. I'm not going to try to give you a comprehensive answer to that, but I will, for those, as you say, for those who doubt that magic and music have any connection to each other, I will focus down on one particular point in history to highlight what happened at that time. And that was the development of recording and the development of published singles. Now, at the outset of records being sold to people back in the 1920s, it's a slowly developing thing between, about 1900 and about 1930 when the record as we recognize it slowly comes into being. But one of the elements of it that you can see as simply a mechanical shortcoming that needs to get solved, but might have some other reasons behind it, is the fact that when records were first produced, because of the granularity of the substance that they were recording onto them, it made better audio when you ran the record much faster. And consequently, records at first, gramophone records, were extremely short in their duration. They were only a few minutes long. So back in the days in the 1920s, when you wanted to listen to Rachmaninoff's new piano concerto that came out in only 1905 or something like that, you would have to buy a box set of records in order to listen to it, and it would unfortunately be chopped up into goodness knows how many 2 or 3 minute chunks that you would have to keep switching over. Now, yes, you can see that that's obviously just a technical limitation of the time, and that got sorted out, and that long-playing records still came into being, and we can listen to long pieces of music now. But it took a long time for that to happen. I don't remember when the long-playing record actually came out. I don't think it was until the 1950s, if I remember rightly. But the point of all of this is that we had decades as a culture of getting used to the idea that music really only came in 3-minute bursts, 3 and 4 minute bursts. And so the whole of popular music culture, in order to fit into the media of the time, had to be reduced down into pieces of music that were 3 and 4 minutes long. And you might think, well, that should have got solved at the start of the advent of the long-playing record. But the truth is that every commercial radio station that's not playing classical music to this day still has these deliberately programmed slots for 2-minute 30 and 3-minute 15 records. And whether you can step as far as to say, there's some agenda behind that deliberately, or whether it's just an accident, it doesn't matter. What's happened is that as a culture, we have got used to the idea that a piece of music has little to say, in the sense that it can only say what it can manage to say in 2 or 3 or 4 minutes. And that most folk nowadays, if you sit them down in front of a decent hi-fi, which has got really beautiful sound, and you say, we're going to listen to a 35-minute symphony, you can see the distress in their eyes before you've even put the needle down on the record, that the idea that anybody should pay strong attention to nothing more than sound for that long, well, yes, I know there are people that still do that, and yet it is difficult to dismiss the idea that we have slowly, whether you believe it's deliberately or simply accidentally, been programmed into listening to music in essentially a blipvert format. And that's a dumbing down right there.
Very scientific, historically correct, and concerning, I mean, the revamped music. Now, again, like for those who don't believe music and magic are real, there's a very interesting way they meld and are connected. And the media lately, and since we've spoken, a lot of things have taken place. Major pop musicians have, since these, you know better than I, but lately, the pop music icons have done some fairly ritualistic displays of occult magic under the guise of publicity. A very recent example is actress Megan Fox being proposed to by rapper Machine Gun Kelly. Quote, Fox claimed via Instagram that she and Kelly drank each other's blood after the rapper proposed. And other examples, I'm not saying rappers are necessarily musicians in the traditional sense. However, Travis Scott, another rapper, Astroworld, and the symbolic occult props used there, and in what is now being called a satanic festival blood sacrifice conspiracy theory. And there are many other examples going back to the 80s metal music, the satanic panic. How is it that music carries so much influence in culture?
Okay. I want to answer that question in two parts here. The first part is addressing this idea that people cannot see a connection between music and magic. I think for that conclusion to be made, most people would have to have a bit of a wonky idea of what magic actually is in the first place. For those who have no experience of it at all, they might imagine that magic is exclusively the realm of drawing pentagrams in chalk and blood on the floor and lighting candles and, doing incantations and even making sacrifices and things like that. All that kind of stuff that you'd find in an old 17th century grimoire about the subject. Magic has dramatically moved on from that. Since the advent of mass media, magic can now take the form of simple mantras. Okay. Now, the reason why a magician in the 17th century would have to perform so much ceremony around what they were doing was to be able to gather the power, to be able to broadcast their intentions to an appreciable population or to an appreciable area. Yeah? That aspect of magic, where you need a power source in order to be able to push it out into the world, well, you don't need that anymore, because in a world where, without first knowledge of anything about magic, you can write some words down on your computer and press a single button, and literally a second later they're halfway around the world and somebody else is reading them. With that kind of technology in existence, the same technology that can stream infinite MP3s down into your phone, you don't need that power of broadcast strength being put into the actual ritual anymore, because that's sorted for you by the technology that we have now. All you need is to have, one, enough of an audience that the message that you are sending gets deeply imprinted into an appreciable number of people, and two, the help of a modern corporation that can spend the money to make sure that your particular song is shoved down the throats of people by repetition in many, many different circumstances, whether it be watching television or shopping in a supermarket or going down the club, it's always the same songs. And if it's always the same songs and it's always the same message in those songs, then everybody around you seems to be subconsciously, unconsciously, or even consciously, God forbid, accepting the messages in the lyrics, or accepting the messages that are subtler but are there inside the very vibrational and emotional tone of the music, then that is affecting people. And, you know, if you have millions of listeners to your music, then you are affecting an appreciable fraction of the population. And it's been demonstrated over and over that in order for a new thought form, a new attitude, a new way of thinking about the world, in order for it to become mainstream, you really don't need more than about 5 to 7% of the population to hold that attitude dear to their hearts for a while, and it simply bleeds into the rest of the population and takes them over. So even though, you know, one of these modern pop divas might actually have a large amount of the population look at them and go, oh, God, no, I don't want that. If they've got millions of followers, and those millions of followers are listening to those songs over and over, well, then those people are being programmed by the lyrical content and the emotional content of those songs. And as such, those people are vectors for everybody else. So that's a form of how music can be magic without you ever having to get a candle or a wand out. Yeah?
So true. And
so that,
yeah.
Go on.
Oh, no, please go on. Go on.
Well, I was just trying to remember. I had two parts to this answer, so please ask me the question again. It was...
Oh, that was tricky. The symbolic... Okay. Well, the strange recent...
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, the recent people and their antics. They're quite obviously... Well, Satanist is a bit of a crude word for it, but it fits in a lot of ways. They're Satanist antics, yes. Well, here's the other part of the answer. The powers that be fully understand how powerful a medium music is for altering the minds, the attitudes, the emotions, the vibrational states of the general public. So it would be ridiculous to think that they wouldn't try to monopolize that, just like they've tried to monopolize everything else, like the news, like health, like education, yeah? They've done this by producing a middleman industry, a layer of bureaucracy in between musicians producing music and people hearing it, yeah? And it's called the recording industry. Now, I know that the recording industry is slowly dissolving because we have now been given the technology. Musicians have been given the technology whereby we can, you know, pretty much publish music to the world for ourselves. But we've had nearly a century of being in that system, and that system is still hanging on to its power in the sense that it is holding the attention of many people who do not give music much of a conscious think through in their head, but it's just something in their lives that's there to cheer them up and fill the void of silence sometimes in their lives. For those people, that's... Sorry, I've lost my thread for a second here. Let me just pick it back up again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In the sense that those people are still, in one way, much more successful than most go-it-your-own musicians. They still hold court over the whole of music, in a sense, because they have still got far more exposure than most solo, not going through a recording company musicians. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And as such, they still hold this thing that says, well, if you want to be famous, you'll do what we say. And that is a filtering mechanism that to this day makes sure that the only people who get into the recording industries and, have enough money and exposure put behind them that within 6 months to a year of the recording company getting involved with them, they're suddenly very famous on the planet. It filters out those people from that system who would say, no, I'm not doing this immoral thing for you. I'm not putting this nasty message out that I don't agree with. Okay? Because they've already seen the choice that they have between doing exactly what they actually want to do and the obscurity that it offers them, and doing what the man says and getting the money so that the man comes back and says, well, if you want some more of it, you're going to do what I say again. Yeah? So not only are these people that are that famous pre-selected in that sense of being bendable to somebody else's will, but they're also clearly people who do not understand the soul-level moral jeopardy that they've put themselves in by being a musician responsible for filling the ears of millions of people with ideas, but then opening that list of ideas that they use to be filled up by people who have no good intentions for the general populace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people's morality is but the lubricant to the machine that makes this thing happen, and they realize that after they sign on. And it's one of those, magical connections, this connection between music and magic, and its recent displays are just wild. I find that it's funny, however, whenever the truly elite are depicted on television, they are well-dressed, in Rolls Royces, listening to classical music, a sort of in-your-face example, much like the occult in music videos, fulfilling that magical principle of having to tell you or tell your victim that what you're doing before you do it, therefore shedding the moral karma, having allowed them to the opportunity to disengage. Tricky stuff has involved with magic and music for years, it seems. What are your thoughts on that they always depict the elite the same way in listening to classical music, which obviously was a more uplifting music?
Well, there's two sides to it. There's simply the image that they're portraying, that they are cultured people, I guess. But yes, also probably more importantly is the idea that, sorry, everybody, but the simple truth of it is that if you listen to classical music more than any other kind of genre of music, you will end up more emotionally stable, more emotionally literate about what's going on inside you, and you will generally have a slightly better quality of life. I've had this conversation with many people now, and the number of people that have sort of bitten the bullet after this conversation and said, yeah, I am going to actually stop listening to this kind of music, and I'm going to expand on the little bit of classical music that I actually already listen to and go and listen to more. And then they come back to me months later and they say, my whole demeanor has changed.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there is this element that they are pushing that in your face for you to see that, yes, if you're going to be one of the elite, then listening to classical music has some part of it. I'm not going to try to connect it with cause and effect or anything like that, but there's some part of it. But the other part, what was the other thing I was trying to say about this? No, I've lost the thread of that bit. Ask me another question, please.
Yes, of course. And a quick thought, and this is since our last conversation and podcast, I did exactly that, and I purchased some classical music, and I listened to it, and oh my gosh, do you get more tracks for the money? But that's not even the point. I noticed that it almost seems as if different parts of the brain fire. And
Yes.
it is something that calms the children in the back seat. And it's the weirdest thing. I noticed a difference. So obviously, does the music you listen to affect your life, and how much? And then I want to get into the hippie culture, and was it a psyop?
Okay. Well, here's my take on why music affects people the way it does in a nutshell. And it's quite a far out idea. So, forgive me, take this with a pinch of salt, chew it, see how much of it rings true for you. I think of music as an information source that comes from the natural world. For tens of thousands of years, the only sources of music or anything resembling music that we had were birdsong, human-voiced song, and what we had in the way of instruments, drums and pipes and maybe trumpets and string instruments. Okay, every single one of these things not only vibrated in its own very particular way. So even if a human being mimics birdsong, you can tell it's a human being mimicking birdsong and not a bird. Similarly, if you try to make a noise like a flute on a violin, you can kind of do a half job of it, and yet people are listening to it going, yeah, that's a violin trying to sound like a flute. Okay? Everything has its representative vibration to it, yeah? Mm-hmm. And it's a natural vibration. Now, in the past 30 years or so, we have had the advent of digital music processing. Digital music processing, besides the simple fact that it always takes the information from the air from two little not ear-shaped machines called microphones, and usually pumps it back out to you through two not instrument-shaped things called speakers or headphones. And yes, you can say that it does a half-decent job of reproducing the sound. Yes, it does. And yet, I personally feel that every human can subconsciously tell the difference, and that what we have been doing this century by listening to so much recorded music, and now it's worsened terribly since we've been using digitally manipulated music, is that we are listening to things which the subconscious mind understands is artifice. Okay? Mm-hmm. So even just the idea of radically changing the reverb on a snare drum hit in a pop song. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something that, a very famous, the backwards reverb snare hit that was in that famous Phil Collins song from the 80s that started that whole trend off of having backwards reverb in songs. These things are physically impossible. You cannot make these kinds of sounds by any acoustic means. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So if they're not part of the natural world, then isn't your subconscious understanding the fact that you are listening to something which is not part of the natural world? Yeah? It's something artificial. It's something plastic. Most of what we listen to nowadays is not only digitally recorded and reproduced, but it's digitally mangled in the middle of its composition as well. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Even in most pop songs, this horrendous thing that almost no non-musician understands is that if you get a band into a recording studio and they have a drummer with them and they play a storming drum track, still afterwards the recording engineer will take that storming drum track and simply go through and replace every single one of the drum hits with their favorite drum sound that they've got in their store and just make those drums play at the same rhythms as the drummer played. Okay? You will not get a natural drum recording from most pop songs. It's completely unnatural. Now, it's all right to say I could go to some fast food joint, buy a burger from that fast food joint, which is only, 22% meat and 78% God knows what. You'd survive it unless it was, something terribly poisonous. It wouldn't do you that much damage. But that's not the same thing as saying, I'm going to live on these things. And if you're listening to pop music all the time, or you're listening to any kind of music, it could be electronic dance music is just as guilty of this, if not more so, yeah? That you are essentially listening to an artificial sound source all the time. You're not listening to any real object to vibrate. Not even the vocals in these songs is how they came out. It's all been altered. And as such, I equate it, as I do with a lot of things in music, I equate music and food, or music and soul food. And if all of your soul food is coming from artificial means, well, I think you can guess how bad I think that is for you and what damage it's going to eventually do to you.
Yeah, I believe that's true. And, listening to the raw music, it seems, can stunt you spiritually in a way.
Yeah. Here's the thing with classical music. To go off on a somewhat different tack here, but one, yes, it is a large collection of acoustic instruments, not only acoustic instruments, but acoustic instruments. If you're listening to an orchestra, usually, unless it's a youth orchestra, everybody in that orchestra is already a real master of their instrument, way beyond, grade 8 passing kind of level. So it's not just, a lot of pop musicians nowadays, they rely on their electronics to make them sound like a half-decent musician. You cannot do that in classical music. You have to actually be capable of producing what people are going to hear, okay? So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that because of this thing I said about, the shortening of forms over the last century and how we are all now used to the idea of imbibing music in 3-minute chunks. Well, if you just translate this into words, spoken language for a minute, okay? Consider the difference between reading a book and going on Twitter, where you're allowed, 144 characters of an utterance at a time, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Twitter is set up to create arguments because people can't explain themselves, because they don't have room to do it. Yeah, they have to reduce what they're trying to say down to a headline almost, and in doing so, all the subtleties have to be ironed out of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, this is true in music. If you insist that you're not going to write music that's any longer than 3 minutes long a piece, then the idea that you could set a theme out and then develop on that theme in any way is already restricted because you simply haven't got time to do it. In a piece of classical music, such time restrictions were never considered a part of it. Yes, classical music composers did write short pieces as well, but many of them wrote very long pieces. And if a piece of music stretches out over half an hour, well, that's essentially the same thing as reading a book. It's got time to not just explain itself and develop itself better, but in doing so, it will engage far more elements of the human mind and the human brain in doing so, because it's going further into the depths of things and it's making you compare and contrast what you've already heard with what you're hearing now. And in doing so, it wakes up a kind of an analytical part of the mind that pop music seems to almost be designed to switch off.
So true. And speaking of limits, I'm getting a limit from my audio here of 10 minutes. So, before we get into a couple more quick questions, I want you to tell people where they can keep up with what you're doing and what you have going on, because I think it's pretty impressive stuff.
Okay. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Odyssey and BitChute if you just type in the word The Conscious Music School. And you can find my website at theconsciousmusicschool.com. What I offer to people, well, let's just go through 2 or 3 things that I offer here. One, for non-musicians, for people who simply love music and actually want to understand what they're going through and what they're subjecting themselves to when they listen to music, I have a little study-at-home PDF course called Soul Food or Poisonous Music, which if you put a couple of hours study in every week for 3 months, you will come to a place by using that course where you begin to understand the influences that your music choices will have on you, and you can begin to make wiser choices about. So that's for the non-musicians. For the musicians, I offer a kind of drop-in specialist service for, one, people who are having problems with their performing if they are troubled by mind issues such as shyness or nervousness or forgetting. And I also have a drop-in service for people who have come to the place where they understand that what they're doing in music does not match, does not vibe with their actual spirit anymore, and they need to come to a place where their art starts to reflect their soul more. I'm a specialist in directing people through a short course into a more soul and heart-centered place in their musicianship. I also have at the moment some slots open for anybody who wants to come and study full-time with me for an hour a week, because I'm looking to start a new way of teaching people music from the outset, which is a much more holistic way of thinking, whereby I include the body, the emotions, the mind, the soul, and then the instrument and the audience in everything that I teach my musicians, right from grade 1 upwards, rather than the modern idea that you simply focus on the instrument and the theory and the history that goes with it, which essentially leaves the human being sat in the room with the teacher out. I go the opposite way, and I say, okay, so you're a musician. Are you a human being yet? When you're a human being properly, then you can be a musician. So that's my service for people who are looking for a regular teacher and want something a little more reflective of their capacities as, you know, an intuitive or a highly imaginative person or folk of that ilk. There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems you're doing more than anyone in the field. And it's so true about the music you listen to. The fact that the music industry has strong connections to the CIA and FBI is also interesting and disturbing. What are they injecting into our music? And why would this, have started in the 60s? Could it have started sooner? It's hard to tell, isn't it?
It didn't start in the 60s. No, definitely not. By the 60s, it was obvious enough that we can now pick up on the history of it to the degree that 5 or 6 books have been written all about that subject. If you go back to the turn of the 19th century, so 1799, 1800, yeah? If you go back to that time, this was a time in European culture, at least, where a system that had been running for a long, long time, where either an upper-class rich person or the church was a sponsor of a musician, and they gave them a pension, a weekly wage, and then expected them to carry out their duties.
Very strange. We're talking about the CIA, the FBI, when the music industry had strong connections, and disturbing enough, we get disconnected. Okay, he's going to try to shoot me over a link and see if I can log on to this audio. This is odd.
Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
We're back on. That was so strange. The fact that we're talking about the CIA and FBI and injecting stuff into our music, and then this takes place.
No, it's not strange at all.
Yeah. So obviously, they are injecting something into the music. It's been there since before the. Thank you so much for doing that, by the way, sending me a link, and they've been doing this since before the hippie culture, you were saying, and it is possibly back to the 1920s. Is that correct?
Oh, no. Further. I mean, look, it's been understood for millennia that music is a powerful force to shape societies, to shape the attitudes of societies. It's very difficult to trace back the actual actions of the people who wanted to influence it, because obviously those things won't be accurately and clearly recorded in history too much. But just consider this, that at the, that turn of the century, as I was talking about, into the 1800s, that Europe had been in a culture where all the musicians that were being paid and making a living from it were already in the employ of the upper classes or the church. So they had control over them to a degree. They could say, no, don't do that, you're not going to get paid. Yeah? Mm-hmm. But at that time, during the lifetime of Beethoven, the advent of the self-employed, publicizing musician came along. Yeah? And suddenly, as is obvious from listening to some of Beethoven's works, such as the Seventh Symphony, which is filled full of French revolutionary songs, the hold that the upper classes had over the musicians started to slip away, and they didn't have the same control over them anymore. This is the time when the advent of that middle layer that I was talking about, the music industry, starts to show itself in the form of impresarios and music critics and the people who own the theaters and the people who pay for the orchestras. Okay, as soon as they felt like they couldn't actually control the composers and the solo performers anymore, they just built this industry around them, which was there to publicize their music to the public, and then took over that and made their demands through that instead.
It's
so
amazing.
That might not have had a forceful capacity to change things as, simply being the Pope and saying, no, you can't write that in the Mass. Okay? But it still had some control. And as soon as the advent of recording came along, they saw it as a powerful method of commoditizing the whole output of musicians and regaining control over its distribution fully. So this thing that we're all now sort of slowly bubbling up into our consciousnesses and being aware of, this thing of the whole hippie movement music of the 60s and, Haight-Ashbury and California being a CIA setup. It's what we're looking at there is just one chapter in how they've used public arts, music especially, to shape the minds of the general public throughout the centuries. What was going on in the 60s movement was simply that there already was a underground, bubbling up, not controlled by them, movement of, first of all, anti-war sentiment, to do with the Vietnam War especially, and also to do with throwing off the societal programming that had been so, clamped down on people in the 40s and 50s, and getting back to a more somatic and instinctual kind of way of being. And both of those things were threats to the authorities. So, as is, something quite familiar to us nowadays, the easiest way to control such a thing is to move in on it and take it over. So, what originally started as, an anti-war sentiment simply became a sentiment of, let's all just get completely blitzed out of our heads and step out of society to the degree that we don't actually have any influence on it anymore.
So true. And, that control, it's moved. It's moved into different areas, different bases, I almost feel that through this, and let's just go, I don't want to get too specific, but through any opportunity that music, media, things of that nature are used to convey particular messages. And something very important that also seems to be of extreme legitimacy is there seems to be a parallel between IQ and the music that you listen to. Can we go into that a little?
Okay, yes. Well, I think that's a bit of a chicken and egg story going on there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There is a way of listening to music which is entirely passive and requires no intelligence whatsoever. It's perfectly possible to listen to a piece of dance music and jiggle up and down to it and enjoy yourself, and hey presto, it's done its job. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly good function of music to loosen you up physically and put you in a better emotional place just by movement alone. That's fine. But that's not what music can do. It's a tiny fraction of what music can do. And I guess we're coming to a place now where it's becoming very obvious that in order to get any more out of music than that, you almost have to be kind of ritually inculcated into the arts. Somebody has to come to you and say, look, this is a piece of music that I really want you to listen to, because for me personally, it can do this, 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 and this to me. It's not just something that makes you smile for 2 minutes and then think, oh, that was fun, and that's it. It made me feel better for days on end. It cleared my mind about this. It gave me solace when I considered this situation. Many, many different things. It's like people have to be shown nowadays that music can do those things to them. Otherwise, they don't go looking for it. And in not looking for it, even when it floats past their faces, they don't really recognize it. Okay? But if you are inculcated into it, either by, accident, by simply having music played to you that really got to you in deeper ways than a pop song can, or you actually had somebody who really understood the power of music and showed you it, then you get hooked into the idea that in order to drain the value from music for yourself, in order to suck the juice out of it, you actually have to listen consciously, not just have it playing in the background while you do the washing up and the ironing, but you actually have to sit down and take it in with all of your attention, just like you would if you were in front of a 12-foot oil painting in an art gallery. You wouldn't just sort of glance over it and go, oh, right, yeah, and then look away again. You'd understand that if you were going to take any of the meaning and the power out of that oil painting, you'd have to stand in front of it for a few minutes and study it and look at everything that was going on in it and connect the symbols going on in the painting to, understood themes in culture and how they might be symbolized. It's a two-way street. You have to chew on it in order to get the nutrition out of it, to go back to that food analogy. And when you come to that place where you understand that music can give you more worth, more value when you do that with it than when you're simply a passive listener, then at that point, music can begin to feed you things which will build up your intellect, your emotional capacities, many things that you would not get if you were only using it passively as a habit.
It's a very powerful thing. It's something that used to get men to go to war. And I mean, broadcasting from a base, and this is something that the parallels, when it comes to the music industry, I do find it funny and hilarious that everybody thinks they're a bunch of Luciferian, goat worshiping, satanic, but
it's a good disguise. It's a good disguise. It's so dramatic and over the top that most people will look at it and go, "Yeah, right, mate, okay," and then dismiss anything else that might be going on that's a bit like that under the surface.
Exactly, it's genius PR. They have good public relations officers on their case because they almost make fun of themselves. And they sell more records. That's what's fascinating.
Well, I think they sell more records because there's an enormous uptick in narcissism in Western culture. And if you can actually somehow subtly display to people that your commoditized piece of art, in the form of a 3 minutes 20 pop song, is definitely going to make you feel good without ever impinging on any of your deep or possibly problematic emotions or challenging you in any way, well, you are basically advertising to narcissists. You're saying this is a quick little hit of a drug that'll make you feel better and won't give you too much of a hangover, and it certainly won't give you any of those deep questions that a nasty psychedelic might. Yeah?
And it is a drug of sorts. Everyone's been in their car, had that song playing at that moment, and realized, wow, the power of music, right?
Well, if you want to estimate this in yourself, consider this. This will not strike everybody in your audience, but it may strike some people really hard. There are some people who have got into a habit with the way that 3 minute pop songs, or 3 minute songs in general work, where all a 3 minute pop song can generally do, unless it's produced by an absolute master, all it can do is to sort of push one emotional state into you. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you try and push two emotional states into a 3 minute song, you're in danger of losing the efficacy of either of them. Yeah? So this is why so much modern music barely even changes its kind of emotional tone throughout a 3 minute song. It's because they're just trying to push one emotional state onto you.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very successful in doing that. You can be in a very down and grumpy and glum state, and you put the right piece of pop music on that you've had memories of dancing to and having fun in the past, and it can completely change your mood state. Yeah. But here's what I was trying to point out to people, is that there are people in our society now who use that methodology, that quick hit of a drug like that, to regulate their own emotions, that they use it so often that they have become essentially addicted, habituated to only being able to regulate their emotions through that methodology. And should you take that away from them and say, can you cheer yourself up? They're powerless to do it now because they've got so used to the pattern that they're in of having to, use that little external pick-me-up to do it, that they don't know any other way of doing it. Contrast this with, a half-hour-long piece of classical music that, in the midst of it somewhere, may have a section which is intensely, black depressed or glum or angry as hell. Okay, and that music will have a transition out of that state into a state of bliss or triumphalism or just sheer warmth and happiness. If you listen to that piece for long enough, repeatedly, that will soak into you, and you will learn the methodology of how to bring yourself back out of that glum state to a better place, because that's what the music is teaching you. This is the difference between what I call, a quick one-shot pick-me-up and real medicine.
Real medicine. What a great word for it. Oh my gosh, Simon. And it is...
Well, medicine means to bring yourself back to the center, does it not? And that's what music does.
Yeah. I mean, if the government is using it as Psy-Ops, it's obviously a very powerful tool that can adjust, bring you to places that have strong connections spiritually, and have you rise to places that some may not want you to rise to.
Absolutely. That's, if you look at what's been pushed on people as popular music for the past 100 years, I defy you to find more than 3% of it that actually puts you in a genuinely spiritually heightened place after listening to it. It's a very tiny amount, and that tiny amount that has got through, I put it to you, it's leaked through somehow, as if by the actions of angels trying to, prevent the complete takeover of music.
Yes. And speaking of that, I know we're going over a little bit, but the artists themselves, classical musicians themselves, they were not, how can I say it? They were not doing things for strategy or out of publicity, necessarily looking, doing crazy, the things we see today. They weren't doing that. In fact, they were savants that did not fit into society. Mozart comes to mind, Beethoven. I mean, so many huge names that really they were just raw talent.
There were musicians back then that were doing that sort of thing to gain publicity.
Were there? Oh, wow.
The machine behind it was not as big, and therefore, it didn't make such an impact. But let's not pretend that it's only wonderfully spiritually evolved people that ever wrote music in the past. For instance, Franz Liszt became such a kind of psychic phenomenon that not only would people faint at his concerts just from kind of emotional overload, but it got to the point in his middle 20s when he was doing a tour around Europe that the women of a town where he was going to play that night would wait at the outskirts of the town for him to arrive in a carriage and horses, and they would unhook the horses and drag their prize into town for themselves. Okay, so yes, these kinds of public relations kind of explosions did happen back then, but at least with somebody like Franz Liszt, he did the psychically healthy thing and let this run its course for a few years until he was rich, and then got the hell out of it and gave up performing in public for the rest of his life and became a composer, because in truth, he couldn't stand these people. They drove him insane.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there always have been dark forces in music. There are famous composers who are absolute epitomes of this, but they used to be the exception. Nowadays, the exception is the person who can play you music for a few minutes and you feel instantaneously lightened, softened, enheartened.
And usually they add it to some kind of advertising, at least in pop culture. And I know we're way over here for a sec.
Don't worry about that for me. You go on as long as you like.
You're so passionate about this. We had some technical difficulty, folks, and Simon bridged the gap and saved the episode. But the interesting thing is, he's going over with me, so I'm going to take advantage of this.
You go for it.
The parallel between that, there is money in music because it is raw emotion that has been transcribed in a way to take others to a place they cannot get to without that assistance. And I feel that the airwaves have been, interestingly, very commoditized. Advertising is a very huge business. And there may be a reason why what we're listening to is programming, not necessarily music. And it's important that we are, as you said, tasteful in what we choose to listen to.
Well, let me talk about valuelessness for a second here. Do you remember in our childhoods that if you loved a piece of music, you went down to a record shop and you paid good money for it to get handed a physical object that you'd take home and you'd put on a media player of some sort or another and you'd listen to? And you were quite happy with that dopamine cycle of going, oh yeah, I've heard 10 seconds of that and I know I like that guy, so let's go and spend some money on that, spend some hard-earned cash on that, and go and listen to it, yeah? And you would appreciate the value in that whole exercise. Nowadays, you go on Spotify, and Spotify will not only give you music for free in an instant, it will also insult the person who wrote it by giving them 0.000 something cents for your listen. Yeah? Mm-hmm. The value quotient for both the listener and the producer of the music has somewhere gone straight down the plug hole, and there's almost no value left. You know, you could listen to music for your entire life nowadays for free, could you not?
You could.
It's everywhere. Okay, and in that social milieu of having so much music for free, the concept that it has to have value really starts to suffer. Because if you're not giving any value out to get that music, well, subconsciously at least, you're not expecting any value back, are you? And this is part of what's happened to music, is that we've all slowly and gently, but very thoroughly, been programmed that music is this thing that just, you know, it floats around us in the virtual ether, and we can have as much of it as we like for nothing. Perhaps, yes, of course, if you really love somebody's music, then you still go and buy the CD or a high quality FLAC of their recording or something like that. But we've lost the idea. It was always dying throughout this century, and the millions of breadline musicians that have existed, show the evidence of this. But we just don't value the art of music anything like as much as we did back before the advent of not just easily, instantaneously accessible virtual streams of these things, but even just the advent of music the advent of music recording full stop. Back when, in order to listen to music, you had to have a musician in your presence, then that musician had some kind of value that it was worth paying for. And that has slowly disappeared. Now, what I'm pointing at here is that in the place that we're in 2022, with, so much hollowness and hypocrisy and narcissism and vanity and
all attributes sold to us as positives, sadly.
Yeah. What I'm suggesting is that this whole advent of expecting recording music to be a healthy, a soul-enlivening art form, I think we're coming to the end of this. I think we're going into a time when the true worth of musicians is going to reappear. And the true worth of musicians, I'm afraid, cannot be transmitted through a CD, through an MP3. It just can't. You have to be in the room with them.
Mm-hmm.
There are elements to a musician's art that are not only not included in the sound, but actually included in the electromagnetic, emotional field of both the musician and the listeners in that room, and how the musician can affect that through their emotions simply because everybody in the room is paying full attention to them. But also the feedback loop that comes from a musician feeling how you are responding and reacting to their playing and subtly changing their playing and their in order to reflect your reaction and your response. I'm sincerely hoping that a large number of people begin to see that the act of treating music as this thing that you can, pop in a machine and music just comes sailing back out of it, is actually a bit of a con job. It's a bit hollow by comparison with the real experience of going to listen to musicians. And as such, some of the middlemen that have been in control for so long because they have had that middle layer in between the listener and the musician, I'm hoping that's going to dissolve again through not only audiences coming to the realization that there is more value to music when you are with a musician than when there isn't, but also in musicians responding to the audiences coming to that realization by specializing, not in being that kind of musician who disappears into a studio for 2 months and then comes out with an album and lets a whole load of middlemen push that product out into the world. No, musicians that specialize in playing to an audience of 20 people, few enough that you can actually see every single one of their faces as you play to them, and giving them an experience because you are that close and that intimate with them, giving them an experience of art that they could not get any other way.
And I've had those experiences, I'm sure many have, where, the musician controls the room. It's much like magic. And everyone is involved, everyone is engaged, and it's a memorable experience. And you've definitely connected the dots between music and magic and spirituality. I can't thank you enough for coming on again, Simon. Let's go into where everyone can tap into what you've got going on and the amazing stuff you have to offer.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me again.
Mm-hmm. And
you want me to go over the links one more time?
Yeah, let's get the links out one more time. There is the Conscious Music School. Is that correct?
Yeah. My main website is theconsciousmusicschool.com. That's an intelligence test. If you spell it wrong, you won't find my website. And also you can find me on YouTube and Facebook and BitChute and Odyssey.
Amazing stuff, and amazing stuff you're doing. You're definitely doing everything that people wish they could do to change society and culture in a way that is amazing. And that's music.
Well, if you're a listener right now and you're thinking this is close to my heart, please come and contact me, because, yeah, I do feel pretty alone in this right now, and I do want a group of people around me who believe the same thing. So, yeah, come forward. If your heart has been set fire by this conversation, please wave your hand. Come and show yourself to me.
It's awesome. It is great. And thanks again. I hope you have a great one, and we'll talk again soon.
Good to speak to you, Ryan. See you soon. Take care.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Simon Siddal, the Conscious Music School, talking government Psy-Ops, spiritual, music, habits. The truly elite, what are they listening to? Is there a reason they are depicted on TV as listening to classical music for no reason at all? Because they're just so dumb? No, I don't think so. Now, as far as a great conversation, Simon knows his stuff. He's a master. For those who believe music and magic are not connected, I very much believe we proved the opposite today. Simon is, well, let's just say he knows his stuff. And to be honest, a lot of stuff. What's new? What's next? I don't know. But keep your eye on that dial and what you choose to listen to. Until next time, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground. Don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off.